In that silence, he did not see targets. He saw geometry, distance, and time. The world once believed that modern combat belonged to machines, yet here a human heart out-calculated steel. These modern military equipment, the rifle, the rangefinder, the computerized sighter, became extensions of one mind, one purpose. Precision replaced numbers. Patience conquered firepower. A single trigger pull traveled almost 4 kilometers, 9 seconds through air and gravity, to remind the world that intellect still matters in war. But while one bullet drew an arc of legend, thousands of drones were already writing the next chapter, the War of Invisible Wings. Over scorched roads and shattered convoys, a new doctrine was born. Stay with us. Subscribe, and follow the untold mechanics of this transformation, the story of a nation turning data, courage, and faith into its sharpest weapon. The night still clung to the Dnipro like smoke. Mist hung over the reeds, silvered by the faintest glow of approaching dawn. Beneath it, 2 figures lay motionless, blurred shapes against the mud. One watched through a cracked periscope, the other whispered numbers into the frost. Sviatoslav Kowalski exhaled slowly, his breath forming tiny clouds that drifted away like ghosts. The air was dense, heavy with river humidity. Every sound, each creak of fabric, each distant motor seemed to echo for miles. He was 58, old enough to remember when war had rhythm and front lines. Now everything was mathematics and wind. Wind speed, 2.4 meters per second. Direction northeast, his partner murmured, adjusting the anemometer. Humidity 73. Temperature 9 degrees. Range confirmed, 3,800 meters. The numbers were steady, but the distance was absurd. At that range, even the planet's curvature bent the bullet's path. He pressed his cheek against the stock, feeling the cold metal like a pulse. This was no duel of mena, it was a dialogue with physics. They fired a test shot at a target 300 meters away. The echo arrived a heartbeat later. Missed, the partner said, 60 meters off. The patient wind shifted. Kowalski nodded, adjusting the dial. No anger, no frustration, only recalibration. The rifle was more than a weapon, it was a symphony of weight, powder, and silence. The optics flickered faintly, translating chaos into coordinates. Around them, dawn thickened, the first orange glow bleeding over the horizon. He checked again. Your distance, angle, pressure, humidity, each variable, a note in an invisible score. The bullet he would fire next would travel 9 seconds through gravity's hand. 9 seconds of history suspended between breath and heartbeat. Somewhere across the river, 5 silhouettes appeared against the rising light. One moved with authority, the officer. Kowalski's partner whispered, "Ready." He answered only with a slow inhale. Ah! The world narrowed to a crosshair trembling over destiny. The crosshair trembled then froze. For 9 seconds, the universe would balance between order and chaos. Kowalski breathed out and pressed the trigger. The rifle spoke, a deep metallic roar that shattered the mist and rolled down the river valley like thunder underwater. The recoil slammed into his shoulder, but he barely felt it. His eyes followed the invisible arc, imagining the path his bullet would carve through air and gravity. 9 seconds. In that small eternity, the round climbed like a silver bird, rising nearly 100 meters above its target before the pull of the earth reclaimed it. The sound of the shot faded long before the bullet landed. When it did, there was no dramatic explosion, no scream, only the faint gesture of a falling silhouette on the far bank. "It," his partner whispered. Kowalski did not move. He simply watched the officer collapse into stillness. The frost on the grass around him shimmered in the wind of the departing echo. He reloaded out of habit. Though there would be no second shot, the silence that followed was vast and unbroken. Between them, no words were needed. Both men knew what had just occurred was more than marksmanship. It was geometry fulfilled, destiny written in ballistics. The partner finally muttered, half in disbelief, 3,800 meters. Kowalski replied softly, then that's how far truth travels. He removed his glove, tracing the cold barrel as though blessing it. For him, it was never about records or glory. It was about precision, about proving that in war, intellect could still outthink destruction. Later, reports would call him the world's farthest marksman. Footage would circulate, turning his name into a legend. Yet, in that moment, all he felt was the weight of a single life taken by calculation. He looked up. The sunrise had fully broken, painting the Dnipro gold. Across that light, the line between victory and remorse blurred like heat above water. The old sniper understood. Wars were now fought less with rage and more with ratios. The bullet was not vengeance, it was proof. Proof that reason still ruled the battlefield. The legend of one shot did not end on the riverbank. While the echo of Kowalski's bullet still drifted through the cold air, another sound began to fill the Ukrainian sky, a deeper hum, constant and metallic. Thousands of propellers. Thousands of eyes. Robert Bravdi, commander of the Eastern drone units, called it the new artillery without shells. His doctrine was ruthless in its simplicity. If you can see everything, you can kill anything. Under his command, the front was no longer a line but a moving map of coordinates, each road a vein to be severed. The soldiers called them the death roads. High above the scorched plains east of Pokrovsk, swarms of small FPV drones fanned out like steel insects, forming an invisible net. Each operator controlled a single machine from a hidden shelter miles away. Young men and women whose weapons weighed less than a loaf of bread but carried the accuracy of guided missiles. Their screens glowed with static and movement. Every pixel might be a target. A convoy appeared. A UAZ truck, a fuel carrier, a motorcycle scout. Within seconds, the swarm locked on. One drone swooped through the open window of the truck, a flash, a bloom of orange light, a trail of black smoke curling into the sky. On another feed, a T-80 tank rumbled forward, its armor glinting like dull silver. The operator marked it, whispered a prayer, and released his drone. The signal cut to white. Moments later, the road was silent again. Bravdi's methodical system turned geography into a trap. Every bend, every tree line, every bridge became a place of calculation. The drones hunted not through rage, but through repetition, an algorithm of patience. Supply trucks slowed down, tank columns hesitated, and even small squads began to crawl instead of drive. Logistics, the ancient heartbeat of army sang, was now choking under the eyes of invisible predators. Satellite images revealed the aftermath. Twisted carcasses of vehicles piled in spirals at the turns, burnt silhouettes marking the terrain. From above, the front looked less like a battlefield and more like an anatomy diagram of destruction. Arteries blocked, motion ceased. In this quiet revolution, these modern military equipment cheap, modular, endlessly replaceable, were rewriting the laws of offense and defense. They demanded no heroism, only observation and endurance. War had become a competition of persistence, not courage. For every shot fired by a human hand, 1,000 mechanical eyes now watched. The world that once marveled at a bullet flying nearly 4 kilometers began to understand. The future of war would no longer be measured in distance, but in data. The thin ribbon of asphalt was, in itself, a vulnerable thing. Convoys moved along it like a line of beads. Each bead carried fuel, ammunition, food, a promise that the front line would remain fed and armed. Break that line, and the promise unravels. Ukraine's drone campaign sought those scenes. A convoy is not merely vehicles in motion. It is a system of dependencies, the fuel tanker that must come first, the repair truck that follows, the light vehicles that scout ahead, and the supply trucks that carry the slow, essential weight. Slow-moving elements force pauses and crossings, bends, villages are places where speed drops and predictability rises. The drone operators learned to read that rhythm. One geolocated feed showed a UAZ pulling onto the shoulder, windows open in the heat of a long advance. An FPV drone darted unseen through the narrow gap and into the cab. The explosion was instant, a plume of smoke, a brief bloom of orange, then silence on that lane. A T-80, heavy and confident on flatter ground, attempted to close the gap to provide protection. The tanks, electronic warfare and steel could blunt many threats, but not when a nimble drone attacked its mobility systems or struck vulnerable optics. The operator's screen blanked, the tank stalled. The most damning evidence came from a single kilometer of road between Novotrozhitsky and Novopinka, where imagery captured 47 armored vehicles strewn like wreckage at a bend. They were neutralized not in a single chase, but in a sequence. One slow truck stalled, a second tried to reverse, a third piled in behind. Each halt created a trap where the next drone found targets made of metal and fuel. From above, the column's orderly advance dissolved into a tangle of burn marks and twisted steel. Motorcycles, once prized for their speed and low-profile aim, proved particularly exposed. Small, fast, and lacking armor, riders found themselves visible to thermal cameras from a distance. Operators would wait for a motorcycle to commit to crossing a clearing. The machine's heat signature betrayed the human beneath. Even groups of 2 or 3 became prey, their speed no longer an advantage when the sky itself watched. What made the tactic ruthless was not its sophistication, but its persistence. Operators seeded observation zones along supply routes and held them for hours, days, weeks. They required no expensive missile salvo or long logistics train, only endurance, situational awareness, and the cheap replaceability of their machines. The calculus was brutal. Deny the enemy the certainty of resupply, and the offensive grinds to a halt. Adaptations followed predictably. Russian units tried night movements, thermal cloaks, and deceptive bait groups. They experimented with dispersion and off-road detours. Yet, each countermeasure introduced new fragilities: reduced speed, vulnerable terrain, exposure to ambush. Where armored thrust once dictated the tempo of battle, the road became the tempo setter. In short, logistics and often the dull arithmetic behind headline sign became the decisive domain. Knocking a supply chain out at its weakest node multiplied effects. One burning truck could halt a column, one disabled bridge could reroute weeks of planning. The footage and the figures were stark. Not every engagement required a duel of armored giants. Sometimes, the smallest machine in the sky turned a bend into a graveyard and a supply route into a memory. In every age of warfare, the decisive factor has never been bravery alone. It has been production. The side that adapts faster, manufactures more, and integrates smarter tools ultimately bends the shape of the battlefield. In Ukraine's case, the most powerful weapon was not a missile or a tanker. It was a principle, affordability multiplied by precision. Each FPV drone cost less than a soldier's monthly ration. Yet when armed with a simple explosive charge and guided by a tablet, it could annihilate equipment worth millions. It required no airfield, no hangar, no pilot risking capture, only an operator with steady hands and signal discipline. In economic terms, the balance sheet of destruction had been rewritten. Bravda's doctrine evolved from this logic: decentralize control, expand production, and treat drones as expendable munitions, not precious assets. Within container workshops and repurposed factories, small teams assembled frames, mounted cameras, and coded guidance systems. Every completed drone represented a line of code turned into velocity, a modern alchemy where innovation replaced armor. The government echoed this mindset on a grander scale. Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal spoke of building an industrial base capable of producing up to 10 million drones by the year 2026 and if, and only if, foreign partners provided $4 billion in funding. It was a stark equation of cost versus consequence. $4 billion to create a wall of eyes in the sky, a deterrent more effective than any imported artillery. These modern military equipment were redefining efficiency. They consumed no fuel convoys, demanded no barracks, and required no medals. They only needed electricity and algorithms. For every tank Russia rolled onto the front, Ukraine could launch 100 drones, each one a fraction of the price yet capable of striking its target with surgical precision. But behind this industrial miracle lay a sobering truth. Innovation, born of necessity, always carries a human price. The cheapness of each drone masked the value of the operators, focuses the sleepless eyes staring at a flickering feed, the fingers that guided death through static. The nation's survival now depended not just on courage, but on circuitry, not just on soldiers, but on software. The factory had become the new fortress, the assembly line, a new front. The enemy did not surrender its mistakes. It learned, adapted, and tried to turn the sky against the net that watched it. When columns found themselves repeatedly punished on exposed bends, commanders experimented. Motorcycles returned as a preferred means of resupply, nimble, low profile, and able to skirt the obvious choke points. Night movements increased. Small infiltration teams began to crawl across fields under the cover of darkness, wrapped in thermal cloaks that blurred heat signatures on infrared screens. Some units adopted decoy tactics, sending poorly equipped detachments forward to draw fire, while better-trained groups maneuvered elsewhere. Each adaptation carried trade-offs. Night marches slowed convoys to a crawl and increased navigational error. Thermal cloaks made troops invisible to certain sensors, but cumbersome and exhausting to wear. Decoys sacrificed people and material in the hope of saving the main force. The very measures meant to evade observation introduced new vulnerabilities. Ukraine's answer was not a single cure, but continual adjustment. Gravdis teams reprioritized targets. The drones that once hunted trucks were reoriented to pick off small infantry groups at night. Operators learned to fuse feeds, combining FPV close-in visuals with ISR thermal sweeps and geolocated intelligence to separate decoys from genuine movement. Patrol patterns became deliberately irregular. Surveillance corridors were shifted. Multiple teams held overlapping zones so that one failure did not mean a blind patch. Captured Russian fighters' testimonies underscored the effect. Many infiltration attempts were detected and dispersed. Commanders admitted that, in this theater, 9 out of 10 small raids failed to reach their objective. That statistic, grim as it sounded, shaped operational thinking on both sides. A more unsettling development was the formalization of what Ukrainian commanders called a minimum monthly cadence, a calculated rate of interdiction intended to outstrip the opponent's mobilization capacity. It was a clinical concept: sustain enough losses, month after month, and the enemy cannot replace men and material quickly enough to keep offensive operations viable. The logic was simple and cold. The ethics were not. Soldiers and planners argued its necessity. Ethicists and chaplains asked whether war could be reduced to an arithmetic grimace. The calculus saved towns, perhaps, by preventing breakthroughs, yet it also demanded a steady supply of operators trained to watch, decide, and act. The human elementi, those who pressed the trigger, those who tended the factories, those who read the screens at 2 in the morning, became the fulcrum of strategy. In that exchange of adaptation and counter-adaptation, warfare moved further from single heroic deeds into a trade of endurance, production, and moral choice. Each new tactic invited a counter, and each counter widened the fault lines where human cost and military logic intersected. The drones kept flying. The commanders kept measuring. The rest of the world watched and, increasingly, learned. Every age of conflict births a new grammar of survival. In this one, Precision has replaced might, and observation has replaced advance. What began as an act of a single marksman, the perfect calculation of distance and windish, has become a nation's operational doctrine. The sniper's breath has been multiplied 1,000-fold through propellers and circuits. The lesson is stark. Dominance no longer comes from massed firepower, but from distributed intelligence. Where once armies sought to concentrate strength, Ukraine dispersed ITANG into small teams, modular production lines, and countless eyes in the sky. Strategy has become a mosaic of micro-actions. Each drone or data feed a pixel in the larger image of control. Industrial logic now dictates operational tempo. Factories are as decisive as front lines. Coding teams as vital as artillery crews. The production of drones, sensors, and software will decide not only battles, but national futures. The factories of the 21st century are not for tanks, but for algorithms. The quiet machinery of persistence. Forecasts point toward a widening gulf. Nations that master autonomy and data integration will dictate engagements without stepping onto the field. Those that cling to old hierarchies of armor and manned air power will find their steel age eroded by speed and swarm. Yet the human dimension endures. Every drone, every rifle, every calculation still relies on patience, focus, and moral restraint. The war of the future will test not just machines, but the capacity of conscience to steer them. The battlefield is expanding beyond geography into code, economics, and belief. The new strategy is not to destroy faster, but to think longer. From the silence of a single rifle shot to the endless hum of propellers above the steppe, the nature of war has changed before our eyes. What once depended on courage and steel now relies on calculation, circuitry, and will. The sniper's calm precision on the Dnipro was not an isolated miracle, it was a whisper of what was coming, a battlefield governed by intellect. In this new era, military equipment is no longer defined by weight or size, but by the data it carries and the purpose it serves. A drone lighter than a bird can decide the outcome of a battle, a laptop can command the destruction of an armored column. The power once concentrated in a few hands has dissolved into millions of circuits scattered across 1,000 workshops. Warfare has become a dialogue between invention and endurance. For Ukraine, this transformation is more than survival, it is reinvention. The sniper's bullet symbolized precision, the drone campaign institutionalized it. Together, they prove that adaptation can compensate for disparity. That thought can rival force. The battlefield of tomorrow belongs not to those with the heaviest guns, but to those who can reimagine what military equipment truly means. Yet amid the triumph of technology, one truth persists. Machines are extensions of the human soul. Behind every feed, every controller, there remains a heartbeat measuring distance against doubt. Progress without restraint is merely another form of destruction. To endure, humanity must evolve alongside its tools, not beneath them. As we look ahead to skies filled with silent wings and fields mapped by invisible eyes, the question lingers, will intelligence preserve us or consume us? Comment your thoughts. Which future do you see? Precision as protection, or precision as peril? Subscribe and follow us, not just for stories of machines and men, but for the search for meaning within them. Because, in the end, the greatest military equipment may still be the mind that dares to ask why. How far can a single bullet decide the fate of a war? Before the sun touched the Dnipro, silence ruled the valley, broken only by the breath of a 58-year-old man lying in frost. Across the river, enemy shadows moved like ghosts on motorcycles.